Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the great myth of the capitalist system. So, this is something that came to mind recently, that a lot of people like to refer to capitalism as a system. But ultimately, I understand that this doesn't actually make sense once you understand what capitalism is and how it works. So capitalism can be described in a number of different ways. There's a Marxist descriptions, there are non-Marxist descriptions, although it is the Marxists that really began throwing around the term of capitalism to describe certain economic qualities. So I think the qualities of capitalism is that in capitalism, the means of production are owned by economically involved agents that are non-institutional. I think that distinguishes capitalism from feudalism, where in feudalism, the lords are economically involved, but they are also institutionally involved. In other words, every lord in the feudal system is simultaneously a politician and perhaps even a military man. Whereas in capitalism, there's no necessary link between those. Okay, so a business owner in capitalism is not institutionally assigned that particular business to own, or by either a political authority or a religious authority, and he's also not compelled to necessarily cooperate with and coordinate with other business owners, even though he can if he wants to. Now, that's of course ignoring the idea that obviously countries protect the property of their citizens. So in that sense, there is an institutional protection on the idea of property, but not necessarily on the operations of a business, even though those can be codified. And the more codified they become, the more regulations exist, the lower the capitalist quality of a system. And when I say quality, I'm not talking about the general quality of how good it is. I'm talking about how much capitalism is in a country. So a good way to describe that then is that the capitalism tendency of a country is strongly linked to how free the market is in that country. So a freer market generally means more capitalism. And this is also important for another distinction that is very important to make, and that is a distinction between capitalism and liberalism or libertarianism. Because capitalism is an economic quality, and while liberals and libertarians might have economic policies that they prefer, their emphasis on freedom actually reduces the free market, generally through the prohibition of the ownership of people. In other words, libertarians usually are not the most free market individuals there are out there because they make moral distinctions that reduce the free market. And the same is true for pretty much all other systems. So conservatives have things that they prefer morally that reduce the free market. Socialists as well, communists, Marxists, fascists, national socialists. They all have moral preferences that reduce the free market. And therefore, there are very few people that can ideologically be described as being individuals that prefer the maximum quality of capitalism in their economy, because very frequently they might have certain objections about moral actions occurring in the economy, even in feudalism as well. I'd like to point that out. And speaking of feudalism, That doesn't mean that capitalism didn't exist in feudal societies, because capitalism is actually very ancient. It's thousands of years old. You can find capitalist qualities in systems all the way back in recorded history to the late Bronze Age, where there's documents on clay tablets discussing international businesses and business owners and how they react and interact with the governments in various cities, and how they conduct business, their sales, what they purchase, and the trades they make. So in that sense, capitalism is very ancient and has existed for a very long time, even before it had its economic peak of influence in modern society. So in that sense, very many types of ideologies indeed are favoring elements of capitalism while also disfavoring other elements of capitalism, usually due to moral issues. For example, people that don't like people selling weed in their neighborhoods. That might be a limitation on capitalism that people enforce due to their moral code, or perhaps due to influence of lobbyists, which is a different issue, but that also decapitalizes a system, is the influence of lobbyists. So in that sense, then the question is, if it's a quality that can exist in different systems, what also is it that makes it distinct from economic systems, for example, socialism? Because in socialism, the means of production are used for the benefit of a society. Now, there's different types of socialism. A lot of people like to use socialism to refer only to Marxism, although I would argue that there are very many non-Marxist types of socialism as well. So the society could be everyone in general. It could be the workers, the proletarians. It could be agriculturalists. It could be the nation. That's national socialism. There's all sorts of different types of socialism on what exactly you consider to be the society that needs to be benefited by the economy. But ultimately, the point is that under socialism, the economy is designed to benefit the society as a whole. And that means that ultimately the economy is systematized in a way. Whether that systematization is centralized or decentralized, that's another issue. But the systematization of the economy in socialism, and even in non-socialist systems such as feudalism, where it's an elitist economy, this systematization of the economy is in direct contrast to the non-systematized economy in capitalist economies. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that in capitalist economies, the people benefiting from the economy, the goal of the economy is not unified. It is in fact determined by each and every economic agents. So some of them may be altruistic, they might want to help others. Some of them may be egoistic, they might want to help themselves. Or they might have different motives. There are charities exist in capitalist economies. There are for-profit businesses that exist. And the decapitalization of systems through regulation is not something that is exclusive to the socialists. Liberals do it, libertarians do it, fascists do it. In fact, I would say that among the general left of today's society, they have a lot more in common with the fascist manifesto than the communist manifesto. although I'm not going to get into that now because that's a long debate and would require me really digging into the texts, even though it's very obvious if you read them. But anyway, the point is that the reforms regarding labor laws that existed to combat abuses occurring in capitalist economies are not reforms that were usually designed to end the ownership of the means of production by the capitalists, but rather were reforms that were designed to address certain moral problems that were perceived to exist in the society. And therefore, to say that capitalism requires and demands socialist reforms to work is simply not true, because feudalists make such reforms, fascists make such reforms, liberals make such reforms, libertarians make such reforms. So to say that any such reform regarding a moral problem in society related to the operation of businesses is socialist simply isn't true. The only people that would make that argument are either really hardcore Marxists that like to take credit for such decisions, or hardcore ANCAPs that describe everything they don't like as socialism. Okay? But ultimately, the point is that capitalism is not a system. It does not have a unified goal. So when somebody says capitalism has failed at achieving this, that, and the other thing, the question is, did they even try? And the answer is no. Why? Because moral agency and moral attempts in capitalist economies happen after the economy, not before the economy. So it's a different perspective, where in socialism, the moralizing happens before the economic interaction. In capitalism, the moralizing happens after the economic interaction. And wouldn't you believe it, in more capitalist societies, people tend to have a higher standard of living. People ended up becoming wealthier. There was less poverty compared to hardcore anti-capitalist societies. And even in the Industrial Revolution, lifespans increased. People had access to greater luxuries, to better medical care than before under the previous, more agrarian feudal economies. So even in the time period that a lot of people like to talk to as the most brutal, the most heartless age of capitalism, the age that produced Karl Marx, people ended up actually having an improvement over their predecessors. And I think that is very telling in regards to the history of capitalism and the history of socialism in relation to it. So ultimately, I would say that when people say the capitalist system, even though it's not really a unified system, it doesn't have goals, it doesn't have necessary cooperation and coordination, it doesn't have institutionalization, because any of those things would actually reduce the capitalisticity of a capitalist economy. When people say that, it sounds to me like there are people that are looking at a windmill and saying, "Behold the giant," when everybody else can simply see that it's an inanimate object. It doesn't have a mind. It's a windmill. And then they attack it. And despite them attacking it, they still lose. And I think that that's hilarious. But anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that capitalism is a system? Do you think that perhaps the Industrial Revolution has been the worst thing to ever happen? Because obviously I'm talking about material wealth and material health, not talking about mental health. That's an entirely different argument to make regarding psychology. But I would also say that socialism isn't very good for psychology either. So that's you'll take what you get. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.